Secondary transactions are something that we're seeing come up more often now, generally on Series B, but we are seeing secondary transactions arising on even as early as A rounds. And therefore, we need to think about some of the tax consequences that can arise, both from a founder perspective and potentially for any of the existing share option holders within the business. So we're going to explore that in a little bit more detail. So Andrew, before we really get into the detail of the tax consequences of a secondary transaction, let's just take a moment. What is a secondary transaction?
A secondary transaction is you're raising a round. For example, you've got a VC coming in, and in a classic fundraise, the VC private equity will come in and acquire new shares.
Yeah.
So they acquire a new class of shares. A secondary transaction is where they may also acquire shares, new equity in the business, but they, as part of a secondary, acquire some existing shares that are held by existing shareholders, essentially giving existing shareholders, sometimes founder teams, for example, an opportunity to take some cash and some risk off the table.
And how generally is a secondary transaction treated from a tax perspective?
So let's focus on the tax perspective of a founder or of an individual.
Yeah.
If you are a founder or an individual who hold equity and are transacting it through a secondary, then any disposal should, he says, as long as you paid market value at date of payment for the shares, be taxed at capital gains tax rates. In order to qualify for business asset disposal relief, which was previously entrepreneur's relief, there are 3 qualifying conditions that you have to meet. The first is that you're an employee or director at the point that you exit the shares. The second is that you hold 5%, which is absolutely critical. And the third is that you've held them for 24 months. If all those conditions are met, you can reduce your headline rate of tax from 20% classic capital gains tax to 10% on your first £1 million of gains.
Perfect. So that's for the founder team, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Question that we get asked quite a lot is, can either EMI or CSOP share option holders also participate in a secondary transaction?
Yeah, so this is a really, really interesting point because it's coming up more and more. We're seeing it more and more getting drafted into new schemes that we're implementing around enabling employees to participate in a secondary if it comes up. But for historic schemes, it's perhaps not always been considered. I think you mentioned at the start, James, secondary transactions are coming more and more in vogue, let's say, coming into people's thoughts, right? We might do a bit of a secondary here. Some schemes don't cater for it. That sits alongside the use of discretion in option contracts. And there was some really useful guidance published recently around the use of discretion in EMI option plans. Historically, I think a lot of companies, founders will have tried to rely on very broadly drawn discretion clauses to allow individuals to participate in a secondary. With the way HMRC are now confirmed, they're looking at discretion, which is if you are triggering something in the options and amending the when or the how of the options, then that is not going to work and it's going to trigger a disqualifying event and your EMI option will become unapproved. It's something you need to think about. There are ways around it though, and I think it's important to say that. If you're looking to recut your scheme to allow for secondary participation, for example, which I think is key in certain cases, because as we said, it's been talked about more and more, you could use a parallel grant. You could cancel reissue if you so desired. There are, we're saying that as if it's something quite straightforward to do. It's something that requires thought. But if you would like secondary participation and your scheme doesn't allow for it, which I think we can sort of analyse and discuss pretty quickly, there is potentially some solves that we can help put in place.
Let's touch on that for a second, because we've talked about a parallel scheme.
Yeah.
That might be something that people haven't necessarily heard about before.
Yeah.
Just take us through high level what the mechanisms behind a parallel scheme is and why you put that in place. So
a parallel scheme is a concept that's it's been around for a long time, but perhaps not particularly well used. The classic case that you use the parallel scheme in is you granted EMI options 9 years ago. An EMI option must be exercised or capable of exercise within 10 years. If they're coming up to end of life and you want to protect the benefits that exist within the existing scheme, but at the same time not allow employees to lose options, you're on a second option in parallel. And it's exactly that. If you have options over 100 shares under the existing agreement, you granted options of 100 shares via a new agreement, and that extends runway on those options. You can try and mirror conditions and conditionality as much as possible, and it just extends runway, but it's options over the same number of shares. So you essentially get 2 bites, and why would you not cancel and reissue? Well, your first options may be at a lower strike price, and you've held them for 2 years, so they may go straight into the business asset disposal relief net. The new options, however, you may be able to draft in secondary participation, for example. So it's 2 bites of the same number of shares, but the way the second agreement is drafted is that if you are to exercise the second agreement, the first agreement falls away, or if you were to exercise the first agreement, the second falls away. So you cannot have the two at once. The critical thing there, I think, is around drafting and making sure you're not giving employees 2 bites of the same thing and trying to essentially double up reward.
Yeah. Interestingly, I think what we've seen recently, especially over the last few years, is an evolution of the drafting of EMI option agreements. Yeah. So historically, I think maybe if we talk about like 6, 7, 8 years ago, we saw a lot of schemes being drafted as exit-only schemes.
Yeah.
And the point that you're raising there with parallel schemes is really important there, because those are now coming to the potentially end of their life cycle.
Yep.
But there is no kind of mechanism unless the company is in a disposal period or an exit event where the individuals will be able to participate.
Yeah.
What we're seeing now is much more aligned to a vesting criteria over a set period of time to allow individuals to exercise options far earlier on in the life cycle, and therefore to actually have the capability and ability to then benefit at an earlier stage.
Yeah, and the ability to retain vested proportions of options at a lever event as well. I think it's much like anything in life, isn't it? As it becomes better understood and the rules of the game become clearer, more established, the recent HMRC guidance on discretion has helped really button down as to what the rules of the game are around use of discretion option contracts. And that ties directly into secondaries. I think previously you could rely on a very loose discretion paragraph, whereas HMRC guidance comes out, right, if you want employees to participate in secondary, you need to be coding that specifically in the agreement, so not as to impact the when and the how. So yeah, as things have become better understood, in the secondaries world, for example, the evolution of option agreements and the way they're drafted is coming to the fore.
A point that we've seen raised a number of times is a tension that exists between a secondary transaction and potentially then rolling directly into attaining a low valuation from an EMI perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, those of us who have been through EMI valuation process before, there's various ways to value a business. You can value it in dividend and assets. Very, very, very rarely used in the tech and high growth space, if ever. Earnings, you can come into earnings or revenue multiple based valuations as a company grows and develops and becomes more solid, BC rounds perhaps. The other key way of valuing a company's shares is a reference to prior share transactions. In particular, HMRC tend to focus on transactions of company shares that have taken place within 12 months of the share option grant. So if you are doing a secondary, and that is a transaction in, say, ordinary shares, because founders tend to hold ordinary shares. If you have a venture-backed coming in and doing some primary, putting some capital into the business and doing some secondary, buying some shares off existing shareholders, you need to understand the impact that has. Because if that is a transaction in ordinaries and those shares stay as ordinaries, that could impact future EMI valuation agreement, because that is a transaction at probably a higher price. And then instead of being like, oh, well, we can argue a low valuation, your HMRC, EMI, or CSIP valuation would likely be pegged to that ordinary share transaction and then perhaps discounted back. Again, it depends on facts and circumstances. For example, if the venture-backed, so the PE coming in buys in their primary, buys, say, Series B shares, and then buys some ords from founders, then immediately converts them up to Series B shares, you've probably got a way around that valuation dynamic, because you can argue that the transaction is actually not in ords, it's in Series Bs in the eyes of the purchaser. Basically, to strip it back, what we're saying, secondary transactions and HMRC valuations are a complex interaction, And if you're looking to bring the two together, or you're planning a secondary, or there's a secondary in the pipeline and you've got option grants to do, let's get together, chat about what the best way, the most optimal way to time frame that out is.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of tension that can exist between a secondary transaction and then rolling immediately into attaining a low valuation for an EMI.
Yeah.
You can therefore, there can be quite a lot of exposure that can be shown.
Yeah.
Either from a founder perspective, which may have a large impact in terms of their tax profile.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you might then have to attain a higher strike price for the relevant employees, but therefore protect the founder position.
Yeah.
But again, as you said before, let's look at it on a case-by-case basis. It's going to be very much predicated based on the wider transaction that the primary and the secondary transaction occurred on, and actually looking at that in quite a lot of detail and determining to what extent does that create a wider risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the last point I would make is that when people do secondary transaction and primaries at the same time, one of the things I think I've always seen companies poor at is narrating the why. Why are they doing that? Narrating that in board minutes. When it then comes to valuation, we go, right, oh God, I wish they'd coded their thinking into board minute. So again, we can help support you on, right, you're doing a primary and part secondary as an EMI option grant to come in the future. How are you going to narrate that in full in the relevant documents to give us the best chance of getting the best outcome for all parties involved, be that the individual participating in the secondary, the EMI option holder participating in the secondary, or the EMI option holder looking at a new grant post-secondary. All very exciting.